Welcome to this webinar, Open by Default, the role of open source software. I'm Ken Chad from Ken Chad Consulting and the founder of Higher Education Library Technology. And it's really pleasing to be talking to the people from Open5th today. Open source, I know, has a lot of interest. So what we're going to do is have a discussion. Please, if you've got any questions, do pop them into the Q&A. As I mentioned, we're being recorded and you've all been muted. So let's get started. And what I'll do is I'll stop sharing that screen. You can see that we have with us from Open5th Andrew Wald, Jonathan Field and Sam Goldsmith. And what I'm going to do is let them introduce themselves as we go through the dialogue. What I would say is that, interestingly, we both started business. I started my consulting business and the guys from Open5th started their business in the same year, all those years ago. So there's some, and we've known each other for a long time and we've talked about open source. So let me stop sharing that screen. Okay. Have I stopped sharing? Let me start by introducing really the whole issue of open source. So at Open5th, previously, of course, PTFS Europe, you've been working with open source for over 15 years now. So what does open source on open really mean in your context? Who's going to take that one?
Well, perhaps I'll just start by just giving a very brief background to who we are before I answer that question. So yes, nice to see everyone this afternoon. Thanks for joining. So just to introduce who we are, I'm Jonathan Field, and I'm one of the two original founders of Open5th, the artist formerly known as PTFS Europe. And as Ken said, we pretty much started up at the same time. We're both still here, which is great. And we've sort of been on this journey together. And I've got with me today Andrew Wald, who's our commercial director, and Sam Goldsmith, who's our business development manager, and she also looks after our academic customers. So as you said, we started in 2007, and our vision was to make technology easy for libraries, and we chose to do that through hosting and supporting open source software. And that's what we do. And many of our staff who work for us now have library backgrounds like myself. I started in academic libraries, as did Sam, but we've also got staff from other diverse backgrounds as well. So we've got a good mix of people, different types of experience. Everything that we do at Open5th revolves around ISO 27001 and Cyber Essentials accreditations. That's very important to us. And you mentioned when we first started, and I look back in the dug out of the archive, which was a seminar we did at the Royal Institute of British Architects back in 2009. And I think it's fair to say that certainly in 2009, pretty much open source was a word that was not something that was commonly known about to a lot of people working in the library sector. And as you sort of scroll down this agenda, there's people from all sorts of organizations here. There's people from EBSCO, there's people from Ex Libris, there's people from OCLC, from Equinox, and some libraries as well. So it's really interesting. Looking back, a lot of the attendees from that seminar back in 2009 are now actually customers of ours and have sort of come aboard with open source over those years. So it's been a very interesting journey over that time. And we support libraries in all sectors, public, government, academic, law, special libraries, all sorts. And we've got customers right across the UK and beyond now. And in terms of what we do, our core offering really is Koha, which is the library management system, and Aspen Discovery, the discovery layer. But we also work with a lot of other open source technologies as well, including Folio, Metabase, DSpace, and more recently Atom, the archive system. So that's a little bit about us. So yeah, in terms of what open source means to us, I guess that's an interesting question for us, because we do see in our travels, we do see a lot of organizations who use the word open in their literature and marketing communications with the library world. And that can often present the company as open when it's not, which is sometimes described as open washing. And it can be used as a marketing tactic to sort of leverage the position of openness and open source. So the sort of traits of open source, such as transparency, collaboration, freedom, but without actually generally adhering to the principles of open source. So I guess examples of that would be things like highlighting open source components of your software while still being proprietary, the lack of freedom to explore the entire code base, describing open APIs, but then having perhaps a cost associated with those APIs, or perhaps a non-disclosure agreement in place to use it, and of course vendor lock-in as well. And in our context, it really means the exact opposite of all of the above. So all of the code that we work with is open, not just a proportion of it, and it's on publicly available websites. Our APIs are truly open, and again, publicly available and documented at no cost. And we don't have vendor lock-ins. So we have examples, quite a few examples of libraries over the years who've continued to maintain Koha because they love it, but perhaps they've taken it in-house and hosted it themselves. We've actually had examples where people have taken it in-house and then come back to us as well, but also examples of libraries who move from one support vendor to another. So we've recently picked up a Koha library in Sweden, who was previously supported with the Organisation of Sweden, and now come to us. And there's other examples in the other direction as well. So in terms of how the actual software is licensed, there's obviously a difference between proprietary licenses and open source licenses. But even within open source, you have a lot of variation. So for example, permissive, copyleft, the main two categories. Koha operates under GNU, which is the general public license, which is copyleft, which means if you use the software under that license, then your entire program must be licensed under the same terms if it's used. And developers love that because for them, it gives them assurance that any improvements they make to the code are also freely available to everyone else downstream. But there's other examples as well. So obviously, we work with software like Folio as well, which is licensed under Apache 2, which is permissive, gives a bit more freedom to the person using the code, and so on. But I guess in our context, it's not just about open source in terms of the software, it's also about open data as well. So the UK government right now strongly supports open data. So that's really the ability to extract all of the data from the application without cost at any time. And if you go onto the gov.uk website, you'll see that they describe this as open by default. So that's really allowing people to facilitate the transfer of data, interoperability, and public access to that data. And for us, that's what we like to see in Koha. Every field and every table is available for use. And then really, I guess, for us as an organization, we've always wanted to be open with the people that we work with by default. So we want to be open with our customers, our partners, in the way we deal with them. And that transcends all parts of the organization, from our support calls that we deal with, the information we put online. So we do a weekly tutorial video called What's on Our Mind. And I guess importantly, explaining to our libraries exactly what we're charging for, what services we're charging for. So I think that's what we see open as.
So what I'm picking up is there's some questions of what open source software is about, but I'm also picking up that there's a culture and an attitude around that as well, that it's more than just a piece of software, that it's a culture and a way you approach things. Now, we've got some people from different areas of libraries. We've got people from the NHS. Obviously, higher education is our main emphasis, but we know that COA, which is, I guess, what people mostly know you for, it's well established in public libraries and special libraries, and certainly in the NHS. But from a higher education perspective, we still see that marketplace dominated by those either traditional or proprietary vendors. What do you think's going on there?
I'll take this one, Ken. I think outside of library management systems, as you said, open source is actually widely used in universities. If you think about applications such as DSpace, repositories, ePrints, Blacklight, Viewfind, and Atom for Archives, they're all open source. But I think the UK has historically been quite wealthy, and where they can, universities have traditionally purchased the library management systems that maybe they see red brick universities choosing, and that might be seen as the prestige systems to have if you can. The UK APUC framework is useful to simplify procurement for universities, but it does allow the institutions to easily re-procure existing systems rather than open up the process. And we are seeing that renewals are becoming more common since the release of the updated framework last year. Perhaps this is because institutions are putting full re-procurement on hold while they deal with more internal upheavals. It can also be said that the framework does tend to favour the larger library service platform providers, and this might be due to access to those knowledge repositories, databases, and e-resources that are held by a key few providers. And open source Koha will always be agnostic to a choice of discovery, but sometimes we find that procurement teams seem to want less choice, not more. And in our experience, the UK HE institutions can be quite risk averse. They tend to stick to the same key few that can show similar sized institutions are supported, and these are rarely open source. And so it's unclear to us whether that concern is from the library, procurement, or from the IT teams at the time. In the UK, the largest library service platforms are still very popular, and this might be because of the simplification of procurement for all those component parts. But we don't really see the same trends in universities in the rest of Europe. Koha is widely used in French universities. The same is true in Finland, where their national library is open source. And in Greece, they have recently implemented Koha and Viewfind for 20 Greek universities to create a union catalogue. So it's hard for us to predict which way the market will go. But we have historically seen the UK following the US in trends for this sort of thing. And this is interesting, of course, because Folio was recently chosen by the Library of Congress. So perhaps we'll see more open source selections starting to happen here. But open source certainly allows you to do more for less money. And as budgets shrink and the pressure starts to be applied to publishers and providers to lower these eye-watering fees and licenses, we might see that open source is becoming more popular. And this is certainly the case in further education, where budget is always a key driver. And we're also seeing universities increasingly disgruntled by the dominance of a couple of the resource providers, especially, for instance, in the wake of the recent Clarivate decisions. In general, though, we do feel that the spirit of open source combines so well with that of the sharing spirit of libraries and open access research and materials, which is an area that is rapidly expanding and becoming more important in HE. So we are really hopeful about the future for open source.
I think you make a very good point, don't you, about the whole framework agreement, which is they've become a lot more dominant perhaps than they were in the past. And I also think it's a good point you make. Certainly, I do a lot of work with research systems, and that is dominated by open source repositories there. So you're right, open source is there. It's really nice to see you involved in the archive markets, another market I've been doing work in. And you just started to touch on that with the problems, financial problems in higher education. Do you see that cost factor as being perhaps the key advantage of open source? How would you distinguish the value proposition, if you like, of Koha and open source compared to other potential solutions?
I'll jump in there, Ken, and build really on what Sam's been saying and Jonathan before Sam, and to pick up straight away on the cost issue. There are really two factors at play there in terms of the value of open source software. One is around the ability for open source software to be implemented with no user license restrictions. So typically on a proprietary system, you're paying for each individual license to use the software, and that's not the case. So that whole charging layer is taken out straight away. And then secondarily, you can ultimately, the principle of open source is that you can download it for free and use it yourself. So if you really did want to, you could, as a university, you could choose to implement Koha yourself and host it yourself, support it yourself, and run it yourself, and take away all of those costs of dealing with a vendor. Now, that might not be a chosen route, but it is certainly a route that's taken. And some of the institutions that Sam mentioned in Europe, and I was in Germany last week at the German-speaking Koha Hackfest in Göttingen, and it was hosted by the GWDG, which is a collaborative IT institute representing both, or providing services for both the Goethe University and for the Max Planck Institute. And they chose and choose to continue to host Koha themselves as an organization. So that's a principle that's at play that can provide the cost-saving benefits, but there are many more benefits. Touched on already has been the openness of the APIs. This is really important in today's world of interconnectivity of software. APIs have got to be open, and they've got to be not just open, but freely open. And that's the principle of open source that I think differentiates it from proprietary software vendors who choose still to charge for access to APIs and restrict the integration capabilities of those APIs to integrate solely with perhaps their own software rather than the greater wider world. And that's all about facilitating the easy exchange of data, and also, as Sam mentioned, giving universities or higher education institutions that want to have a choice of alternatives, gives them the ability to choose alternatives, so they don't have to necessarily opt for the monolithic library services platform solution, but can choose a system, a piece of software that integrates with their first choice in their reading list management software, or their student records management system, or their student learning outcomes platform, whatever it might be. So that's a key benefit as well. Another benefit that's not unique to Koha, the library management system that we work with, but to many open source projects, is that many of those projects are not supported by just one single organization. There are open source software projects that are supported primarily by one organization, but Koha is not one. It's supported by multiple vendors, multiple support companies around the world. And we, as one of those, OpenFifth is one of those, one of the leading vendors of Koha globally, but we work collaboratively with those other companies. We don't work in competition. And what that means is you get a more localized support potential. So in the UK, you're most likely, if you opt to use Koha, to be supported by OpenFifth, as we're the lead support company for Koha in the UK. We're UK based. If you chose to use Koha in France, you'd probably choose to work with BibLibre, because they're the leading vendor in France, and they're France-based, and they offer French language support, obviously. Now that gives you a more localized support infrastructure to help you use the software, but it also gives you the benefit of the collaboration between those multiple organizations that we work with as a community. Another couple of benefits for using open source software, and specifically Koha, would be around security. So it's often a question mark around open source software as to whether it's secure. And the answer to that is as secure as, if not more than, proprietary systems. And that's because of the open nature of the code base. So it's counterintuitive. It's open code. Why is that? Why does that not make it less secure? But actually, it in experiential terms makes it more secure, or at least as secure, by virtue of the fact that there are more eyes on the code, that issues get spotted more quickly, and the disaggregated nature of the development effort means that there's more likely to be somebody jumping very quickly onto a patch to fix a vulnerability in the code base as soon as is humanly possible, given the global nature of the developer community associated with these projects. And finally, I just touch on sustainability, because I know that's a key driver for value decisions in organizations like in the HE sector. And it's often argued that open source software has sustainability built in to its production. So code is often reused. The software itself is designed in such a way as to be able to run on the most basic hardware possible, as well as the most sophisticated hardware possible, making it potentially cheaper and lighter weight to run and to implement. And it's often very efficient in its software design. So code is swapped. Coding development projects are worked on by multiple organizations globally in collaboration rather than in competition, and so leading to swifter development cycles. So those are just some of the benefits I'd like to sort of highlight in the value proposition.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I thought that point about community extending beyond obviously to customers, but to what in a proprietary sense would be competitors. So working with those other, and I guess that means that different people can take on board different elements of development. You can do stuff that's specific to the UK or whatever. But I wanted to loop back a little bit to something that Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, and in a sense that informed the heading of this, and the UK government guidance on open source. How important do you think that's going to be, especially in terms of the higher education market? And also just want to put in, if people do want to ask their own questions, there is the Q&A, so you do have the opportunity there. So yeah, pop any questions into the Q&A. Sorry, Jonathan.
No, it's interesting because obviously, well, the gov.uk website is probably not our favourite bookmarked website, but if you go on there, and primarily through the Government Digital Service, actually, they've established a clear preference for open source solutions in its technology code of practice. You can find the technology code of practice on the gov.uk website. And the core principle behind that is to try and use open software first, and to only consider proprietary alternatives when there's a good reason to. So there are perhaps there are better value for money propositions, or there's very specific reasons for doing so. And the reasoning behind this really is, well, firstly, to avoid sort of single vendor dependency, which is obviously can be a risk. Importantly, to ensure that code can be reused in different applications or contexts. So really sort of go back to what Andrew was saying there about the sustainability of code, that you're not rewriting the same code over and over. It's more sustainable to write the code once and then reuse it in different contexts or applications. But also promoting open data and encouraging collaborations. So in terms of what that means for libraries, I guess really, hopefully, it means that go forward, it does sort of challenge the dominance of proprietary library systems. And as we know, the traditional library management system market has been dominated by a few large proprietary vendors, certainly in academia over the years. But interestingly, the sort of, if you go read it, all public bodies, which obviously includes universities, need to better understand how to work with open source and procure open source. And interestingly, one of the problems that we see inside of procurement departments is procurement officers often don't understand how that procuring an open source system is actually no different from procuring a proprietary one. Because at the end of the day, there's still a contract with an organization. In that case, it would be us. And you've still got the obligations in terms of an SLA, the security obligations to manage your data under GDPR and so on. So I do think systems like Cora Folio, they're obviously there to challenge the proprietary dominance. But interesting, if you look at legislation outside of the UK, then there's also some interesting things happening in Europe as well, because I think the European Union are becoming very conscious that they're very heavily dependent on tech, largely for the US. And their approach has been they use this phrase, think open, and that's their sort of approach going forward. And they're looking at all sorts of pieces of software where they have reliance on perhaps US companies or big tech organizations. So they're looking at replacement for things like Microsoft Word, Google Docs. There's an open source project called Docs, which is not very interesting name, but that's what it's called, which is basically an open source alternative to those. They started to use systems like Matrix, MetaMost to replace things like Teams and Slack. But yeah, going back to the UK, NHS England have been a great example of sort of following this guidance. I mean, they've really backed open source, and I guess more specifically Cora, to support the libraries as part of NHS England. And right now, 6 of the 8 regions of NHS England are already adopted open source. And we've literally just started 2 more projects, which will complete those other 2 regions in 2026, which is well over 200 libraries. And importantly, it's speaking to them, they've told us it's a significant saving for NHS England. But I think also importantly for them, it's an opportunity for them to work with other health-minded organisations like the UK HSA, so they could develop applications that might be applicable to all of them, together. And they've done a large amount of work on interlibrary lending, which is going to be great for them. It's going to be great for UK HSA as well, but it's also great for other libraries around the world because, of course, all those libraries will ultimately benefit from that work. And that has seen large, yeah.
Just let me jump in there. And as you were talking about the NHS and the government, I was thinking back to the role of JISC. JISC had a big role in many years ago in terms of open source repositories. And that's why, I mean, Sam highlighted the fact that in higher education repositories, it's a pretty much still an open source landscape. So do you think there's perhaps a role for JISC here to galvanize or to help in terms of the sorts of things you've been talking about in open source, in motivating it?
I think there is. I mean, I guess JISC also have their fingers in a lot of pies, working in all sorts of interesting projects. But I think there definitely is a role for JISC because obviously they are the overarching organization. And I think open source really works well in those sort of scenarios where you have a large organization like NHS England or somebody like JISC who are driving that sort of road to sort of open source and collaboration and bringing people together to work together. And that's certainly what we've seen in NHS England. The number of trusts that have come together, working together now, has been absolutely fantastic.
So I wonder, picking up on that community thing, are people coming to you in that particular? I was thinking in the NHS context and saying, there's a group of us, we want to do something. Do you have the ability to, not quite, perhaps bespoke's not quite the right word, but to respond to those particular either domain specific or sector specific or functional specific things? Whereas perhaps I'm thinking, it's true to say that if you're a big proprietary vendor, the UK, for example, is probably a tiny percentage of your market. I wonder if you could perhaps pick up on some of that too, in that context of community, really.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to jump in there. Just going back to the roots of Koha, and we're actually celebrating this year. We're going back to New Zealand for the 25th anniversary of Koha as an open source project, and it's important probably to let people know, or remind some people who've maybe heard this before, but Koha was born in libraries. It was created by software developers in libraries, not by a software company deciding it would be a good idea to write a library system. It was librarians who wanted to create an open source library system, and they called it Koha because Koha is a Maori word that translates loosely as gift, but more specifically as a reciprocal gift. So the idea that if you want to take something out of the project, if you want to use the software, then in some way it would be good if you could put something into the project. And so the idea of collaboration and contribution is right at the very heart of, certainly of Koha and of many open source projects. But just picking up on a question that's come in the Q&A, that doesn't mean you have to support it yourself. It doesn't mean you have to be a developer. It doesn't mean that you have to be able to write code. It might be just as simple as you use it. You as an institution have chosen to use it, and that's the only contribution you can make, but that's the contribution. But there are many other ways that organizations get involved in contributing to the community. There are obviously the developer community. There's the developer community that's a worldwide network of developers writing the code. But there are also there's a network of people who get involved in testing the software, and that's often actually librarians wanting to test out something that they've suggested to the community that's then been developed, and then they get to test it and say, yes, that's the right thing. That's what we wanted. Yes, we're happy to sign that off. And that's an important part of the process. There are also translation communities. There's a documentation team that's a trans-global team. So there are lots of ways of getting involved in that community. And librarian involvement in that community is very much still at the heart of the project, of the Koha project, and it's an abiding principle of the way the communities run. So we're just in the process actually of moving the community into a foundation and join the Open Library Foundation. And I've been involved in the group that's working on writing the bylaws of that around that process. And enshrined in those bylaws is the need to always involve librarians in the governance of the project and in the future direction of the project. Those librarians obviously that want to take part, it's not forcing everyone to do that. Not everyone has to sit in the board meetings, but those who do want to can, and importantly, they're the people that will hold the reins in terms of the project's future. KohaCon, the international annual conference for Koha, is often hosted or co-hosted by libraries. In fact, the Dach Koha Hackfest that I was at last week, that was hosted, as I said, by the GWDG, which is not a vendor company, it's not a support company, it's an organization that runs Koha itself. But just to bring to life the idea of how that community can benefit the future direction of the development of the software, Jonathan touched on the work that NHS England has done in contributing to the development of the further development, the enhancement of the interlibrary lending module within Coha. Now, their contribution was, yes, financial in terms of funding the development, the code writing that we've undertaken. But it was more than that in terms of obviously their steering the direction of the code capability. So very much we were looking at how those 6 and then 8 regions are going to interlend with each other, how they're going to access the e-resources that they want to use and that are very specific to the NHS context in terms of the providers that they use. But because they've chosen to use Coha and to use Coha as the interlibrary lending engine, and because we're doing the development here in the UK, and we work, as I mentioned earlier, with these other vendor companies around the world, we're also working with those vendor companies and what their local drivers for interlibrary lending are. What are the needs for that part of the community in the USA around interlending that mean we need to bear that in mind when developing what could have ended up as being a very NHS specific development, but instead has become a development that's suitable for our context in the UK, our context for health libraries in the UK, but is also appropriate for academic institutions wanting to connect, for example, to services like Rapid ILL or Rapido, which are also part of that integration capability and automation capability that we've built in. And we're also working with mentioned already have been the National Library of Finland in Helsinki, who use Coha and self-host Coha, but they're very interested in the supply side of interlending and making sure that Coha is supporting the international standard of interlending, particularly around supplying as well as borrowing. And so we're working with them. We're doing the coding, but we're making sure we pay attention to the requirements there. And that's building in a collaborative way a better piece of software for everyone. So that's just kind of one small example, bringing to life how the community works to drive better software development and better applicability of the software universally.
What I want to do is jump to a question that Simon's put in that I feel really challenged by myself, actually. It's a really good question. So why am we all sitting here using proprietary software when part of what you were talking about, Jonathan, and what you've been talking about, Andrew, is this sort of wealth of open source alternatives? And I feel that's a really good question because I think higher education library technology itself is based on open source software. But here I am using, Zoom, and I think it brings to mind for me that kind of almost challenge of almost herd instinct. We go with things. I attend Zoom's webinars. It's well understood. So there's a kind of for me, I guess, a kind of herd instinct. But he does really. That's a really good question. It means because it does challenge us, doesn't it? That there's all these good things, all the things you're doing. There's so much great open source software out there, but there still seems to be that easy lean into proprietary stuff. I thought that's an excellent question.
I think
how you thought about that.
It's tricky to answer because it's multifaceted. Yes, it's the ease. But and Sam points to the fact that there's often lock-in. So one of the things that we struggle with, NHS England, we love them, and they've really got behind the idea of open source technology. But get them to use anything other than Microsoft Teams, and you'll really struggle because they're a Microsoft organization. Yeah. Their IT is very strict on what they can download, what they can use, and what they can access, and that's a constant sort of struggle that we have. But that said, Jonathan and I, in the spring this year, were at a conference in Paris called the Open Source Founders Summit. And that's a gathering of either founders or key leaders of open source software projects. And what you get a feel of, a sense of at those sort of gatherings is that there is an application out there. There is an open source application out there. And it was a very challenging Jonathan and I had a very challenging conversation as to why we still use Google Workspace when actually there's an alternative that we could be using for our document management, for our email system, an open source alternative. And it's something that we've implemented a project to take a look at and work out how we can move to that. But it's definitely, there are hurdles there. There are hurdles within IT parts of organizations, and there are mindset hurdles around just what's easy and just what's more available at the press of a button than perhaps seeking out the open source alternative.
Yeah.
And nobody got barred for buying IBM, as they say.
But yeah, I thought it's a great question, because I say that's something like you, I've been really need to think about my adoption, or everybody's adoption generally, of open source. So we're coming towards the end, and one thing that's certainly always on my mind is that we have a complex ecosystem, don't we? Have you just mentioned bits of it, interlibrary loan or resource sharing and repositories, and I'm dealing more and more with research systems infrastructure, more than just repositories. So, and you touched a little bit on the areas of interoperability. And I wondered too if you could talk about, this is a sort of question that's come to mind a bit, about one of the gaps. What I was thinking about in terms of when you mentioned resource sharing interlibrary loan is there's still no open source central index of e-resources. That still seems to be well, not just dominated, but exclusive to the proprietary vendors like EBSCO or Clarivate. I wonder, in terms of the future, if there's any gaps you feel, I mean, building on resource sharing, that you see opportunity to fill. So it's about ecosystems, and I suppose a subset of that is where do you see, the next gaps, the next challenges that you might address?
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I mean, in terms of sort of interoperating with other sort of systems, I mean, I think open source does sort of lower the barrier into entry for that. And well, actually, go back to the summits that Andrew mentioned that we were in Paris earlier this year. A lot of the talk, of course, was around AI, and it's quite interesting that that's an area where open source really is at the heart of. I know we're all being sold at the minute, but open AI is based on a lot of open source stuff, and open source is at the heart of a lot of this technology, and I think it will continue to be going forward. Which I think is probably why the UK government are so invested in AI. So I think that's an interesting area to watch. I think in terms of the actual content, the difficulty with the content is that it's, as you know, the vast majority is commercial content right now. People want large sums of money to get access to it. And open source communities don't typically have, well, certainly not individually, have vast sums of money to be able to access and make that subscription content available. I think one interesting thing is, I think as open access journals become more and more prominent, I think that's going to be a great opportunity to start building up more open knowledge base of these open access articles. And that's certainly something that we've talked about as an organization. How can we actually, at the very least, start by building an open access knowledge base that we could make freely available to not just to COA, but potentially to all sorts of applications, because there's all sorts of systems that could potentially interoperate with that kind of knowledge base. So yeah, I think it's important. Well, obviously, keeping this stuff open makes it easier to access. As Andrew says, we know there's people who still charge for APIs. That's where area we don't want to get into. We even hear about people who still charge libraries to get their data out of systems, their own data out of systems. And I mean, we had a classic example of it just in the last month, where a vendor's charging a library try to charge a library tens of thousands of pounds to access what is their own data, surely is their own data. So obviously that's what goes back to all this government open data. We want this data to be all available and free and be able to move about freely. So yeah, it's important that we get this interoperability right.
So
yeah,
do
and
you
I
think
think
there's
open access.
a role? It struck me a while back that if there was a concentration of effort by the community on that aspect of interoperability and APIs, and as you rightly say, on open APIs, maybe that could be deliver some really useful fruit, so to speak.
I'm quite cynical about the fact that a lot of publishing is quite high value though at the moment, Ken, and I don't think we'll be able to defeat that until maybe HE institutions are favouring open access as on their reading lists, for example. But until that happens, they're still going to be buying their Elsevier and very expensive subscriptions, which of course you can't get via open access.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, well, we're closing down now, nearly at time. I just wonder, we've got no more open questions on the Q&A. I wonder if there's any, closing remarks. I've certainly, the things I'm picking up are, you've mentioned interoperability, the community aspect of open source, working with other companies that might in a proprietary world be seen as competitors. And it sounds, what's also come across is a real global mindset too, that you're involved and working with all sorts of other places. I think it's really interesting what you've been saying about the NHS and how they've been really working well with you. Is there any other kind of point or comment that you'd like to make before we close down?
I guess we're still, I mentioned that conference in 2009, and really, I guess 16 years ago is actually not that long ago when you think of the whole, think about my lifetime and obviously the lifetime of technology. So I think we're really probably still at the early stages of this sort of open source revolution. I think revolution is too strong a word, but adoption of open source. So I think we've still got a long way to go yet. I think there's a long way to go with this open source journey, particularly as I said, with it being at the heart of AI. And so yeah, I think watch this space over the coming years because yeah.
Okay, well look, thanks to you all. It's been really interesting. I think we've covered some interesting ground, had some great questions as well. And so I'll call it a day. Thank you very much. There will be a recording of this. It'll take me a little while to just get that done, but we will circulate that. So thanks for everybody for attending. And if you want to follow up, do feel free to email me or any of the people from OpenFit. So thanks, participants. Thanks to the panelists, and have a good rest of the day.